In November 1864, the renowned frontiersman Kit Carson embarked on a bloody confrontation with the so-called Lords of the Southern Plains, the Comanche and their allies. The ensuing engagement, later known as the First Battle of Adobe Walls, saw Carson and his men outnumbered 10-1. Yet the outcome of this clash remains a story both extraordinary and haunting. Why would Carson, a man deeply familiar with the cultures and landscapes of the West, provoke the Comanche on their own homeland? What exactly was Adobe Walls, and why did it become the backdrop for one of the most pivotal conflicts between the U.S. Army and Native American nations? And perhaps most importantly, what legacy did Carson leave behind, one that continues to spark debate? By 1864, the Comanche, along with their allies, the Kiowa and Kiowa Apache, had launched a series of bold and relentless attacks along the Santa Fe Trail, a critical artery for trade and travel. These raids were not random acts of violence. They were calculated strikes aimed at defending ancestral lands and asserting dominance over the southern plains. As one contemporary observer described it, the Comanche were hosting a high carnival, with scarcely a week passing without a bold display of resistance. The Comanche's confidence was not without reason. They openly boasted that they would kill any white man who dared to tread their roads. And if General James H. Carleton, the military commander in New Mexico, retaliated, they threatened to kill him too. Their defiance was emboldened by circumstances. For several years, the U.S. Army had been preoccupied with the Civil War, leaving vast stretches of frontier land virtually undefended. During this period, raids by the Comanche and Kiowa pushed the frontier line in Texas over 100 miles to the east, reclaiming lands that had been steadily encroached upon by settlers. The situation became dire enough that General Carleton dispatched Kit Carson, already a veteran of numerous frontier conflicts, to bring these incursions under control. Carson was not merely a military officer. He was a figure deeply entwined with the history of the West. Having spent decades living among Native Americans, he spoke their languages, understood their ways, and had once been an ally to some tribes. His mission to confront the Comanche was not just a military operation, but part of a broader and deeply fraught struggle between two worlds, the encroaching settlers and the indigenous nations fighting to preserve their way of life. Before diving into the events of the First Battle of Adobe Walls, it's essential to understand the life of Kit Carson, the man tasked with confronting the formidable Comanche. Carson's story is one of contradictions: bravery and ruthlessness, connection to native cultures, yet complicity in their suffering. His journey west began in 1826, at just 16 years old, when he joined a diverse group of mountain men. Over the next decade, he earned a reputation as a skilled fur trapper and, controversially, as an Indian fighter. Despite his small stature, standing only 5.5 feet tall, Carson was renowned for his unyielding courage and resilience. He proved his mettle in countless engagements, whether against hostile forces, including native warriors, Mexican troops, Confederate soldiers, or even a towering French-Canadian adversary with a severe lack of decorum. Although Carson was illiterate, his intelligence and adaptability were unparalleled. He spoke Spanish and French fluently, mastered several indigenous dialects, and even used sign language to communicate with tribes across the western frontier. Carson's skills as a frontiersman were legendary. He could track any movement, locate water in the harshest conditions, anticipate ambushes, and interpret weather signs with remarkable accuracy. By the time he was called to confront the Comanche, he was a seasoned veteran of 2 wars and had an intimate understanding of the vast expanse of the western United States. Carson's military career advanced during the Civil War, when he rose to the rank of colonel in the U.S. Army. After distinguishing himself in the Battle of Valverde, he was assigned to campaigns against the Mescalero Apaches and later the Navajo in 1863. His campaign against the Navajo was particularly devastating. Under orders, Carson implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying crops, livestock, and homes, effectively starving the Navajo into submission. This led to the tragic Long Walk, a forced march of hundreds of miles to the Bosque Redondo Reservation, a barren and inhospitable place that became synonymous with suffering and loss for the Navajo people. Though Carson's methods were brutal, They reflected the harsh and unrelenting policies of the U.S. government at the time. His effectiveness in these campaigns made him the obvious choice to confront the Comanche, who presented their own set of challenges. The Comanche were masterful horsemen and tacticians, whose deep knowledge of the plains gave them a distinct advantage. Carson's plan was to attack their winter camps when they were most vulnerable and destroy their villages, supplies of dried meat, and buffalo robes. He hoped that such devastation might force the Comanche to consider surrender. However, this strategy underestimated the resilience and unity of the Comanche and their allies. For generations, they had defended their lands with unmatched ferocity, and Carson's mission was about to collide with one of the most formidable native forces the U.S. Army had ever encountered. And so, in mid-November 1864, Colonel Kit Carson embarked on his campaign into Comancheria, leading a force of about 400 soldiers armed with 2 mountain howitzers. Among them were 75 Ute scouts, trusted allies who brought vital knowledge of the terrain and the tactics of the plains. Despite his reputation as a resilient frontiersman, Carson was no longer at his peak. At 55, after a lifetime of grueling hardship, his health was failing. Years of physical strain had taken their toll. His joints ached, his vision was deteriorating, and an old injury from a horse accident left him in near constant pain. Carson was far from the vigorous figure he had been just a decade earlier, but his determination remained unshaken. The campaign led Carson's forces deep into the heart of Comancheria, a vast expanse fiercely guarded by the Comanche and their allies. After days of navigating the rugged plains, Carson's scouts located a small Kiowa village along the banks of the Canadian River, approximately 70 miles north of what is now Amarillo, Texas. It was the eve of Thanksgiving Day, 1864, when Carson issued orders to Major William McCleave to lead the charge against the village at dawn. The village, consisting of fewer than 100 lodges, may have seemed like an easy target to the U.S. Army, but the Kiowa were far from defenseless. As the soldiers advanced, Kiowa warriors sprang into action with fierce resistance, defending their homes and families. In the midst of the chaos, the warriors prioritized the safety of their people, ensuring that women and children could escape the assault. Their courage and tactical skill allowed them to retreat strategically, avoiding unnecessary losses, while leaving the village temporarily in the hands of McCleave and his men. This skirmish exemplified the Kiowa's adaptability and resilience. Though outnumbered and facing modern artillery, they managed to disrupt Carson's plans, regrouping and preparing for the larger confrontation yet to come. It was a testament to the indomitable spirit of the native nations, who had long defended their homelands with unmatched bravery. The temporary victory at the Kiowa village quickly turned precarious, as neither Major McCleave nor Colonel Carson were aware of a much larger Comanche camp located upriver. While the Kiowa had initially retreated, they soon returned, bolstered by significant reinforcements from the Comanche. The plains, once quiet, now echoed with the arrival of hundreds of warriors determined to defend their homeland. Recognizing the dire situation, Carson immediately rode to McCleave's position. Upon witnessing the overwhelming numbers of the assembled forces, estimated to be around 1,400 warriors, Carson made the critical decision to fall back to an old trading post known as Adobe Walls. Originally established by the Bent brothers in 1843 as a trading hub, Adobe Walls had been abandoned just a few years later due to conflicts with native groups. By the time Carson and his men reached it, the post was little more than a few crumbling adobe ruins, hardly a stronghold, but better than nothing for desperate soldiers seeking cover. With his men quickly forming a defensive perimeter among the ruins, Carson prepared to confront the advancing force. The Comanche and Kiowa warriors, renowned as some of the greatest horsemen in the world, charged in a fierce and thunderous wave. Their brightly painted bodies and war cries symbolized a deep-seated resolve to protect their land and people. This was not merely a battle. It was an assertion of identity and sovereignty against an encroaching force. As the warriors descended upon the defenders, Carson's troops brought their mountain howitzers into action. The small artillery pieces, though primitive compared to modern weaponry, unleashed thunderous volleys that momentarily disrupted the charge. Yet, the Comanche and Kiowa's courage and determination were unwavering. They regrouped and continued their assault, undeterred by the unfamiliar firepower. The standoff at Adobe Walls was far from over, and the balance of power hung precariously. Carson and his men faced not just a tactical challenge, but a reckoning with the sheer will of nations who had honed their skills in defending these plains for generations. The use of artillery at Adobe Walls, though primitive, momentarily shifted the tide of battle. The booming mountain howitzers disrupted the initial charge of the Comanche and Kiowa warriors, forcing them to retreat out of range. For a fleeting moment, Carson believed the worst was over. Yet even legends like Kit Carson were not immune to miscalculations. Assuming the warriors would hesitate to attack again, he began to plan a counteroffensive, intending to move downriver and target the Comanche villages one by one. But Carson's confidence was short-lived. As his men prepared for their next move, he noticed something alarming on the distant Blonde Plains. What he saw was nothing short of overwhelming. 3,000 mounted warriors emerging from the Comanche villages. This force, one of the largest gatherings of Native American fighters in the West, quickly mobilized, preparing to crush Carson's small contingent. The odds were staggering. Carson's men were outnumbered nearly 10-1. The soldiers, some still chewing on their sparse meal of dried meat and hardtack, were thrown into action as the warriors charged once again. The Comanche and Kiowa came in relentless waves, their painted bodies glinting in the fading sunlight, their war cries piercing the air. The defenders managed to repel the first assault, only to find themselves immediately under attack from another direction. The warriors, demonstrating remarkable coordination and courage, launched attack after attack, their determination unwavering. Even Kit Carson, a seasoned veteran of countless battles, later admitted he had never witnessed such daring bravery, stating that the warriors acted with more daring and bravery than I have ever before witnessed. The chaos of battle was suffocating. Gunpowder filled the air, choking the soldiers, while the thunder of cannons and the sharp cracks of rifles reverberated. The cries of injured men and dying horses mixed with the fierce war whoops of the Comanche Kiowa and their Ute adversaries, who had sided with Carson. Amid the turmoil came an unexpected twist: dueling bugles. A Comanche warrior, having acquired an old army bugle, used it to mimic the calls of Carson's forces, creating confusion among the soldiers. When Carson's troops sounded an advance, the Comanche bugler signaled a retreat. Conversely, when the army signaled a retreat, the Comanche bugler called for a charge. This ingenious tactic added another layer of chaos, delaying the soldiers' ability to respond effectively. The battle raged for hours, well into the evening. The defenders clung to their positions, fighting off wave after wave of warriors. The mountain howitzers, while far from sophisticated, played a critical role in keeping the attackers at bay. Without Carson's leadership and the artillery's firepower, the confrontation could easily have turned into another Little Bighorn, a devastating defeat for the U.S. Army. Instead, it became a testament to the resilience and courage of both sides, with the Comanche and Kiowa displaying unparalleled determination to protect their land and people. Amid the chaos and relentless waves of attacks, Kit Carson's leadership stood as a beacon for his outnumbered men. No matter how dire the situation became, Carson was there, urging his troops to stay calm and focused. His voice cut through the mayhem as he directed them to concentrate on the immediate threat, the warriors charging directly at their defenses. "Don't worry about those gathering in the distance," he insisted. "Focus on what's right here, right in front of you. Stand firm and keep fighting." Carson's words were more than tactical instructions. They were a rallying cry for survival. His ability to inspire composure and determination in the face of overwhelming odds reflected not only his military experience, but also his deep understanding of human resolve. For his men, surrounded and outnumbered nearly 10-1, panic would have meant certain disaster. Carson's insistence on dealing with one challenge at a time kept the defenders grounded, turning what could have been a chaotic rout into a disciplined stand. There's a timeless lesson in Carson's leadership. In moments of overwhelming adversity, focusing on the immediate challenge, one step, one issue at a time, can make all the difference. His advice wasn't just for the battlefield. It's a principle of resilience that echoes through the ages, reminding us to face each challenge with clarity and resolve. Colonel Kit Carson understood all too well that his small force could not hold off the relentless Comanche and Kiowa warriors indefinitely. Unlike the glorified battles often depicted in tales of the West, his troops had limited ammunition, and their survival hinged on calculated decisions rather than bravado. With every wave of attackers, the soldiers were pushed closer to exhaustion. Carson knew that if the warriors launched just a few more charges, his men would be left swinging their rifles as improvised clubs. Faced with mounting pressure from his officers to launch a counterattack, Carson made a different call. He was not George Custer, a man driven by ego and a lust for glory. Carson had always been pragmatic, valuing the lives of his men over the illusion of victory. He recognized when a fight was beyond his control and made the difficult but necessary decision to retreat. This was not an admission of defeat, but a calculated move to preserve what remained of his command. However, retreating in the face of an overwhelming enemy was no simple matter. With numbers stacked heavily against them, a disorderly withdrawal would almost certainly lead to a massacre. Carson rallied his troops, insisting on a disciplined retreat. "Stay steady," he urged. "Do not give in to fear." His leadership remained steadfast, guiding his men to maintain their composure even as the enemy pressed closer. The retreat was far from easy. The Comanche and Kiowa warriors pursued them relentlessly, launching some of the fiercest attacks of the day. As Carson later recalled, the Indians charged so repeatedly and with such desperation that for some time I had serious doubts for the safety of my rear. Though he was likely referring to the safety of his column's formation, every man in the line must have feared for his own survival. Then, as if the situation weren't dire enough, the warriors set the grass ablaze. Smoke enveloped the soldiers, creating confusion and allowing the Comanche to close the gap. Flames licked at the edges of their path, and the air filled with acrid smoke and chaos. Yet through the fire and mayhem, the two small mountain howitzers roared on, their volleys buying precious moments for the retreating column to regroup. Carson's ability to manage such a precarious situation reflected his experience and clarity under pressure. The retreat was not just a fight for survival, it was a battle of discipline and resolve against a relentless and determined enemy. The warriors of the Comanche and Kiowa nations fought with unyielding bravery, forcing Carson and his men to rely on every ounce of strategy and resilience to escape what could have been their last stand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the plains, the relentless assaults from the Comanche and Kiowa warriors finally subsided. Perhaps they felt they had delivered a resounding message to Carson and his men, a warning that their land and people would not be conquered without a fight. Satisfied with the day's efforts, the warriors began to withdraw, returning to their villages, leaving the battlefield scorched and littered with the echoes of their defiance. For Carson, this moment offered no relief. He knew that hesitation could spell disaster. Without pause, he commanded his men to press on, riding through the cold, unforgiving night to put as much distance as possible between them and the pursuing warriors. Exhaustion gripped the soldiers, and their horses, pushed to their limits, stumbled over uneven terrain. Carson himself bore the strain of the journey. When the troops finally halted the next day, his horse's saddle was removed to reveal skin worn away from the grueling ride, a stark testament to the physical toll of the retreat. And so ended the first Battle of Adobe Walls, a brutal and exhausting encounter that left both sides scarred but undefeated in spirit. For the Comanche and Kiowa, it was a day to reaffirm their strength and resolve, a reminder of the resilience of their people and their lands. For Carson and his men, it was a hard-fought escape, a narrow survival against overwhelming odds. This battle, while often framed as a military engagement, was much more than that. It symbolized the clash of two worlds, one seeking to expand and dominate, the other defending centuries of culture, sovereignty, and identity. The story of Adobe Walls is not just a tale of survival. It is a chapter in the larger narrative of resistance and resilience that continues to echo in the history of the plains. To this day, the outcome of the first Battle of Adobe Walls remains a matter of perspective. Both sides have reason to claim victory, and the interpretation largely depends on how one defines it. Did Kit Carson achieve his mission to subdue the Comanche as he had with the Mescalero Apaches or the Navajo? Certainly not. The Comanche and Kiowa held the battlefield, asserting their dominance over the land and continuing to do so for years after. By this measure, it was undeniably an indigenous victory, a powerful demonstration of their resilience and mastery of the plains. Yet, Carson and his men managed something extraordinary as well: survival. With odds stacked heavily against them, outnumbered 10-1, they endured wave after wave of relentless assaults and emerged alive, battered but intact. For Carson, this was a triumph of leadership, discipline, and sheer determination. The fact that only 3 to 6 soldiers lost their lives, depending on the source, and just 21 were wounded, is almost miraculous given the ferocity of the fighting. This achievement speaks volumes about Carson's ability to maintain order and morale under unimaginable pressure. Leading a retreat in the face of overwhelming numbers without descending into chaos is a feat that would challenge even the most seasoned commanders. Carson's skill in rallying his men, coupled with the tactical use of artillery, allowed them to escape what could easily have been a massacre. The Battle of Adobe Walls was more than just a military engagement. It was a clash of endurance, strategy, and resolve. For the Comanche and Kiowa, it reaffirmed their power and determination to defend their homeland. For Carson and his men, it was a testament to their discipline and survival against staggering odds. Both sides walked away with a claim to victory, and the echoes of that conflict continue to resonate as a symbol of resistance and survival on the American frontier. From a Native American perspective, Kit Carson's foray into Comancheria could also be seen as a partial success. Tribes like the Comanche approached warfare with a different mindset than the drawn-out campaigns favored by the U.S. military. For them, a successful raid was about precision and efficiency, entering enemy territory, inflicting damage, and withdrawing with minimal losses. By this measure, Carson's raid mirrored some aspects of their tactics. His forces struck deep into Comanche lands, inflicted considerable losses, and managed to escape with most of his men intact. Carson's survival against overwhelming odds was remarkable. He lost only a handful of soldiers. Sources vary, estimating casualties at 3 to 6 men, while native losses reportedly ranged between 50 and 200 warriors. This stark difference in casualties underscores both Carson's tactical acumen and the fierce resistance of the Comanche and Kiowa warriors, who inflicted as much damage as they could before forcing the U.S. forces into retreat. From the military's official standpoint, the battle was deemed a victory. General James H. Carleton, Carson's commanding officer, lauded the campaign as a brilliant affair. He praised Carson for his leadership, declaring the engagement to be another green leaf to the laurel wreath which you have so nobly won in service to your country. Such praise, however, was not unusual. Military leaders often framed engagements in a positive light to justify the costs of war and maintain morale. Yet, Carson's own reflection on the First Battle of Adobe Walls paints a different picture. With characteristic humility, he later admitted, "The Indians whipped me in that fight." His acknowledgement speaks volumes about the resilience and tenacity of the Comanche and Kiowa warriors, whose determination to defend their homeland left an indelible mark on Carson and his men. The battle, with its contrasting narratives of victory, highlights the complexity of frontier conflicts. For the U.S. Army, it was a testament to Carson's ability to adapt and survive under extreme circumstances. For the Comanche and Kiowa, it was a powerful reminder of their strength, their ability to repel invaders, and their unyielding commitment to defending their way of life. Following the Battle of Adobe Walls, Kit Carson would spend the remaining years of his military service constantly on the move. Stationed first at Fort Union, then Fort Garland, and finally Fort Lyon in present-day Colorado, Carson's focus shifted from battlefield engagements to a quieter but equally challenging role. By November 1867, Carson was officially mustered out of the Army. The fight at Adobe Walls had been his last. From that point forward, Carson devoted himself to peace rather than war, helping to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes, including his longtime allies, the Ute. In late winter and early spring of 1868, Carson made one final journey to Washington, D.C., accompanying Chief Ouray and a delegation of Ute leaders. Their mission was to secure a more stable and permanent reservation for the Ute people, a task Carson took to heart. However, this trip was not solely about diplomacy. Carson's health had been deteriorating, and a recent diagnosis by Dr. Henry Tilton at Fort Lyon revealed a grim reality. Carson was suffering from an aortic aneurysm, a condition for which there was no known cure at the time. Hoping for a miracle, Carson sought a second opinion from specialists in the East. While in Washington, Carson met with Generals Philip Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman, as well as his old friend and former expedition partner, John C. Fremont. It was Fremont who advised Carson to consult with a doctor in New York City. Determined to leave no stone unturned, Carson traveled to Manhattan with the Ute delegation in tow, staying at the Metropolitan Hotel on Broadway. Unfortunately, the doctor's prognosis confirmed his worst fears. The aneurysm was untreatable, and there was little to be done but wait for the inevitable. For a man who had faced countless dangers on the frontier, this diagnosis was a stark and humbling reminder of his own mortality. The doctor's words left no room for false hope. There wasn't nothing nobody but God could do about it. Carson, who had spent a lifetime navigating the rugged landscapes of the West, now found himself facing a final, unwinnable battle. Later that evening, Kit Carson awoke from a haunting nightmare. In his dream, he felt his spirit rising, floating toward the ceiling, as if his body was giving in to the inevitable. He woke drenched in a cold sweat, only to find one of the Ute chiefs cradling his head like a child, offering comfort as Carson cried out in desperation for his Lord Jesus. The vividness of the dream left Carson shaken, a stark reminder of his fragile mortality. At the same time, his wife, Josefa, was carrying their 7th child. Despite the devastating diagnosis of an aortic aneurysm, Carson was determined to make it home to see his child born. His resolve to survive and reunite with his family carried him through unimaginable exhaustion and pain. Reports suggest Carson may have sought a second opinion in Boston before continuing westward. From there, he took a train to Cheyenne and then traveled by stagecoach to Denver. By the time he arrived, his strength was so depleted that he needed 3 days of rest in a hotel before continuing his journey. Eventually, Carson hitched a ride on the back of a wagon to La Junta, Colorado, where he was finally reunited with Josefa. Their reunion was brief but bittersweet. Just 2 days later, Josefa gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Josefita. Carson, now so weak he could barely hold his newborn child, was visibly deteriorating. His health worsened, with violent coughing fits that brought up blood. Dr. Henry Tilton, who had been caring for Carson, resorted to administering a mix of opium and muscle sedatives. When that failed to ease his suffering, Tilton resorted to chloroform to provide the old mountain man with some measure of relief. Tragically, while Carson's health faltered, Josefa's condition took a dire turn. She contracted an infection following childbirth, and despite Dr. Tilton's best efforts, she succumbed to the illness just 2 weeks later. On the day she passed, she seemed well, brushing the hair of their teenage daughter, Teresina. Suddenly, her condition worsened, and she cried out for her husband. Cristobal, she called, her tender name for Carson. Though barely able to rise from his own cot, Carson found the strength to go to her side, holding her in his arms as she took her final breath. Josefa's death devastated Carson, leaving him grief-stricken and physically weakened. It marked the beginning of the end for a man whose legendary resilience had been tested by not only the hardships of the frontier, but the profound losses that defined his final days. According to his son Charles, Kit Carson seemed to wither away following the death of his beloved Josefa. Overwhelmed by grief and his own failing health, Carson called for Josefa's sister, Ignatia, to help care for his children. His strength ebbed daily, forcing him to stay at Dr. Henry Tilton's home, where he received round-the-clock care. Carson spent his days lying on a small cot wrapped in buffalo robes, struggling against the relentless coughing fits that brought up blood and left him breathless. In an effort to ease Carson's mind, Dr. Tilton would often read to him in the evenings from his own biography, The Life and Adventures of Kit Carson. The memoir, dictated by Carson in the late 1850s to Jesse Turley, had later been edited and published by DeWitt Peters. While not as sensationalized as the penny dreadfuls of the time, Peters had still embellished the narrative, what Carson once described as laying it on a little thick. Despite its inaccuracies, the biography served as a small comfort, reminding Carson of his legacy during his final days. On the evening of May 23, 1868, Carson appeared to rally, asking Dr. Tilton for a hearty meal, a buffalo steak and a cup of coffee. He savored every bite, and for a brief moment seemed like his old self as he reclined in his robes and lit his trusted clay pipe. Yet not long after, around 4:25 p.m., the inevitable struck. Carson began coughing uncontrollably, blood pouring from his mouth as the long-feared aneurysm finally ruptured. Summoning the last of his strength, he called out to Tilton, "Doctor, compadre, adios." These were his final words. Dr. Tilton rushed to Carson's side, cradling the dying frontiersman until he passed away. Kit Carson, one of the most enduring figures of the American frontier, died at the age of 58, exactly 1 month to the day after Josefa's death. Carson and Josefa were laid to rest side by side in Boggsville, near Fort Lyon, Colorado. However, a few years later, their remains were reinterred in Taos, New Mexico, a place Carson had long called home. Today, they rest together in the Kit Carson Memorial Cemetery, where their lives and legacy remain etched into the land they once traversed. As Kit Carson's life came to a quiet end in Colorado, momentous events were unfolding in New Mexico, events that would mark a turning point for the Navajo people. Just days after Carson's passing, General William Tecumseh Sherman visited the Bosque Redondo Reservation, a place infamous for its inhuman conditions. Sherman saw firsthand the bleak reality of the reservation, later describing it as a mere spot of grass in the midst of a wild desert, where the Navajo had been reduced to absolute poverty and despair. Sherman's visit spurred action. Recognizing the unbearable conditions at Bosque Redondo, he initiated the drafting of a new treaty. On June 1, 1868, the Navajo signed the treaty that would allow them to return to their homeland. Though the land they were granted, roughly the size of Ohio, was a fraction of their original territory, it included their sacred Canyon de Chelly. This marked the beginning of a hard-won return to their ancestral lands, an outcome that carried profound significance for the Navajo Nation. The journey home began on June 18, 1868, and remains one of the most poignant chapters in the Navajo's history. As they approached the Rio Grande and caught sight of the Blue Bead Mountains for the first time since their forced exile, many fell to their knees, overcome with emotion. They wept, their tears mingling with the dust of the long trail they had traveled. The mountains, a symbol of their homeland and cultural identity, stood as a beacon of hope and renewal. As the march continued, their voices rose in unison, chanting an ancient song that echoed through the plains. Beauty before us, beauty behind us, beauty around us, in beauty we walk, it is finished in beauty. These words, steeped in tradition, carried the weight of their suffering, their resilience, and their connection to the land. The journey home was not merely a physical return. It was a reclamation of identity and spirit. It symbolized the enduring strength of the Navajo people, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable hardship, their cultural roots ran deep, sustaining them through generations. Kit Carson's legacy is one of deep complexity, admired by some as a hero and condemned by others, particularly the Navajo, as a villain. For many Native Americans, his name evokes painful memories of forced displacement and devastating campaigns. Some have even drawn comparisons between Carson and figures like Hitler, a stark illustration of the lasting scars left by his actions. There's no denying that Carson's relationship with Native Americans was multifaceted, marked by both compassion and complicity. He spent decades living among various tribes, marrying 2 Native American women and raising children who shared his blended heritage. He was a lifelong friend and advocate for tribes like the Ute, refusing orders to execute Apache and Navajo men indiscriminately. Carson openly condemned Colonel John Chivington as a dog for orchestrating the brutal Sand Creek Massacre, in which over 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho were slaughtered. As an Indian agent in Taos, Carson was known for his fairness and compassion. Yet his legacy is equally defined by his involvement in atrocities. Carson participated in campaigns to capture and enslave indigenous people in California and was complicit in at least 2 massacres there. He also led an attack on a Klamath village in Oregon, leaving a trail of destruction. Though he decried the Sand Creek Massacre, the death toll in some of the lesser-known events he took part in was even higher. Perhaps most infamously, Carson was the architect of the U.S. Army's scorched earth policy against the Navajo during the Canyon de Chelly campaign. By destroying crops, homes, and livestock, he effectively starved the Navajo into submission. While Carson did not personally escort the Navajo on the long walk to Bosque Redondo, a forced march that claimed thousands of lives, he played a central role in setting the stage for their suffering. His brief tenure at Bosque Redondo, lasting only 3 months, does little to absolve him of responsibility for the appalling conditions there. Even if one excludes the long walk from his record, Carson's actions at Canyon de Chelly caused untold suffering. How many Navajo children starved during that campaign alone? These questions remain a source of anguish for many. Carson's complexity lies in his dual roles. He genuinely believed he was fulfilling his duty, often hesitating to say no to authority despite his personal misgivings. When ordered to confront the Navajo, he initially sought to resign, but was denied. Even after the long walk, Carson repeatedly tried to leave the army, but his requests were ignored until his declining health left him unable to serve. Ultimately, Kit Carson was a man of his time, a figure whose actions reflected the contradictions of a nation expanding westward, often at the expense of indigenous peoples. While he may have felt justified in his decisions, his legacy remains a reminder of the enduring costs of those choices, with wounds that have yet to fully heal.